My parents took care of my brother's kids, while calling mine a burden. Now they want to be grandparents again. I had long since stopped expecting fairness from my parents. Fairness was for other families. It was for people who grew up knowing that love came without conditions, that parents didn't play favorites like a game of chance, that children weren't weighed and measured against one another like livestock at auction. But my parents had made their choice a long time ago, and they hadn't chosen me. No, that privilege belonged to my brother. He had always been the golden child, the perfect son, the one who could do no wrong no matter how many mistakes he made. And when he had children of his own, my parents had extended that same blind adoration to them. They were precious. They were cherished. They were everything my own children were not. I had watched as my parents fawned over my brother's kids, like they had been personally gifted to them by some divine force. I had seen the expensive toys, the extravagant birthday parties, the never-ending stream of praise and affection. They had funded his children's lives, paying for daycare, covering school tuition, ensuring they never knew a moment of struggle. And yet, when I had children of my own, they became a burden. My parents hadn't paid for a single diaper, hadn't sent so much as a card on their birthdays. They never offered to babysit, never asked how my kids were doing, never showed the slightest interest in being grandparents to them. And when I finally confronted them about it, when I dared to ask why my children were treated like unwanted guests while my brothers were treated like royalty, my mother had simply sighed, exasperated, as if I were a fool for even questioning it. You had them. You deal with them. Like my children were an inconvenience, like they weren't worthy of the same love, the same devotion, the same basic human decency my brother's kids received without question. I had left after that. Not just the conversation, not just the room. I had left them. And I never looked back. Years passed. Years where my children grew up never knowing what it felt like to have grandparents who adored them. Years where I made sure they never needed the love my parents refused to give them. We built our own traditions, our own celebrations, our own family that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with the people who actually cared. And we were happy. Then, out of nowhere, the calls started. First it was my mother, then my father. Each voicemail dripping with feigned regret, carefully crafted words that reeked of guilt rather than love. "We miss you," my mother's voice crooned through my phone one evening, the static from the poor reception making it sound almost ghostly. "We miss the kids. It's been so long. We just want to see them, just want to be a part of their lives again." I deleted the message without responding, because it was a lie. They didn't miss us. They missed the idea of us. The version of us that would allow them to rewrite history, to pretend they hadn't spent years ignoring my children like they were less than. But my kids weren't a charity case. They weren't forgiveness wrapped in human form, and I wasn't about to let my parents waltz back into our lives just because it suddenly suited them. Yet the calls kept coming. The texts followed. And then, one day, they showed up at my house. I opened the door to find them standing on my front porch, looking smaller than I remembered. My mother clutched her purse like a lifeline, her perfectly styled hair slightly disheveled from the wind. My father stood rigid beside her, his usual air of superiority dulled by something that almost resembled unease. It was the first time in years that I had seen them in person, and yet I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not longing, just nothing. "Sweetheart," my mother breathed, her voice laced with a forced warmth. You need to leave." She flinched, her painted lips parting in surprise. "But No." My voice was firm, unyielding. "You don't get to show up after all these years and act like we're still family." My father exhaled sharply. "That's not fair. We made mistakes, yes, but..." "Mistakes?" A bitter laugh escaped my throat. "No, forgetting someone's birthday is a mistake. Losing someone's number is a mistake. But you didn't forget us. You didn't lose our number. You chose to ignore us." My mother's eyes watered, but I didn't fall for it. I had seen those tears before, tears meant to manipulate, to guilt, to shift the blame. "Please," she whispered, "we just want to make up for lost time. We want to be part of their lives now." My jaw tightened. Now, when their golden son's life wasn't as perfect as they had thought. Now. when they realized they had put all their faith into the wrong child, when my brother had proven himself to be nothing more than a leech who had sucked them dry and left them with nothing. "Why?" I asked, tilting my head. "Because he disappointed you? Because you backed the wrong horse?" My father's face darkened. "That's not true." "Isn't it?" I challenged. "You poured everything into him, into his kids, and now that it's blowing up in your faces, you want a do-over? A second chance? Well, I hate to break it to you, but life doesn't work that way. You don't get to pick and choose when you're family." Silence hung between us, thick and suffocating. And then, finally, my mother whispered, "We just want to fix things." I exhaled slowly, staring at them. The people who had given me life, but never love. And then I said the words I had been holding on to for years. "Some things can't be fixed." I stepped back, ready to close the door, but my mother reached for me, her fingers grazing my arm in desperation. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "We love you." I met her gaze, my voice quiet but firm. "No," I said. "You love what I've become, but you never loved me." And with that, I shut the door. The sound of it closing was the final nail in a coffin that should have been buried long ago. They knocked. They called my name. But I didn't answer. They didn't stop. I had expected them to, had assumed that my firm rejection would be enough, that the finality in my voice would deter them from continuing this charade of regret. But I had underestimated just how persistent they could be when faced with the crumbling remains of their own mistakes. The messages kept coming. The calls grew more frequent. And then there were the gifts. Boxes delivered to my doorstep, wrapped in pristine paper, each one carrying something meant to stir up nostalgia. A photo album filled with old pictures, half of which didn't even include me. A delicate necklace that had once belonged to my grandmother, a woman they had conveniently forgotten I had loved. And then, the worst of them all, a toy. A simple, well-worn stuffed rabbit that had once belonged to me as a child. I hadn't seen it in decades, had long since assumed it had been tossed away like everything else that reminded them of my existence. Yet here it was. Crumpled ears, faded fur, one of the button eyes barely hanging on by a thread. I held it in my hands, staring down at it in silence, feeling nothing but a hollow emptiness where emotion should have been. It was a manipulation tactic, a feeble attempt to remind me of something good, to make me believe that our past had been filled with warmth and love, instead of cold indifference. But I wasn't that same child anymore, and I wasn't about to let them rewrite history just because it was convenient for them now. I dropped the rabbit back into the box, closed the lid, and set it by the door. The next morning, I sent it back. "You're being cruel." That was the message my mother sent me after the package arrived back at their house. No pretense, no fake warmth, just raw, bitter resentment woven between the lines. The mask was slipping, and I was glad, because it was exhausting watching them pretend they had changed. I didn't respond. I didn't need to respond, but that didn't stop my brother from showing up. I spotted his car the moment I pulled into my driveway. It was an expensive model, sleek and polished, the kind of vehicle that screamed, "I am better than you," before the driver even stepped out. My brother leaned against it, arms crossed, watching me with that same condescending amusement that had haunted my childhood. I sighed, gripping the steering wheel tighter before finally killing the engine and stepping out. "If you're here to deliver another guilt trip," I said, shutting the door behind me, "you might as well turn around now." He smirked. "Always so dramatic." I rolled my eyes, moving toward my front door. "I don't have time for this." "Yeah, you do." I paused, exhaling sharply before finally looking at him. "What do you want?" His smirk widened. "Mom and Dad are pissed." I let out a humorless chuckle. "Good." His smirk faltered. "They're trying, you know, more than they ever have. And you? You're just throwing it back in their faces." I arched a brow. "And what exactly am I supposed to do? Let them waltz back into my life like nothing happened? Let them play perfect grandparents now that they finally realized I wasn't the failure they thought I'd be?" He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Look, I get it." "No, you don't." He blinked, caught off guard. "You don't get anything. I continued, my voice sharp, controlled. You've never been on the outside looking in. You've never had to wonder why the people who were supposed to love you the most treated you like you didn't exist. So no, you don't get it. His jaw tightened. They didn't hate you. I laughed, shaking my head. You're right. Hate would have at least required some level of passion. They just didn't care. And now they do. But only because they need to. Because they backed the wrong son, and now they're left scrambling to fix it. His silence was all the confirmation I needed. I took a step closer, lowering my voice. So tell me, how bad is it? He stiffened. What? The mess, I said smoothly. The reason they suddenly want to play happy family. How much did you screw up for them to come crawling back to me? His face darkened, his composure finally cracking. I had hit a nerve. Good. I leaned in slightly. Did they finally realize you're not as perfect as they thought? Shut up, I smirked. Because now I knew. I had suspected it before, had felt it in the way my parents' desperation reeked of something more than just regret. But now I was sure. Something had happened. Something had shattered the illusion of their perfect son. And now they were scrambling, trying to fix the mistake they had spent decades refusing to acknowledge. I don't know what you did, I mused, watching as his fingers curled into fists. But I do know one thing. This sudden need to make things right, it's not about me. It's about them. It's about you. Shut the hell up, he growled, stepping closer. I didn't move. You need them now, I murmured, my gaze locked onto his. And they don't have anything left to give, because you drained them dry. His nostrils flared, his hands trembling at his sides. And that was when I knew. He had drained them dry. Whatever wealth my parents had flaunted, whatever money they had spent spoiling him and his kids, it was gone now. And with it, so was their illusion of power. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. I exhaled, shaking my head. Get off my property. His eyes burned with resentment. You're a selfish... I smiled coldly. And you're a parasite. His fists clenched, his body practically vibrating with barely restrained anger. But he knew better than to push it. Because unlike our parents, I wasn't about to bend just because he demanded it. I stepped around him, unlocking my front door. And just before I disappeared inside, I turned to glance at him one last time. You should tell them to stop trying, I said, my voice quiet, final. I'm not coming back, and neither are they. I shut the door, and I walked away without looking back. It didn't stop. If anything, my rejection seemed to fuel their desperation. The texts became more frantic, laced with a pleading tone that hadn't been there before. The calls came in waves, first from my parents, then from unknown numbers that I could only assume were their friends, people they had roped into their pathetic crusade to guilt me into submission. And my brother? He wasn't done either. I should have known he wouldn't walk away so easily. He had spent his entire life being the center of attention, the golden child, the one who was never told no. And now, with everything slipping from his grasp, he was clawing at anything he could reach, even if it meant coming after me. The next time I saw him, he wasn't alone. I had just finished picking up groceries when I spotted his car parked in front of my house again. This time, my parents were with him. My mother sat in the passenger seat, looking anxious, while my father stood outside, his hands tucked into his pockets, his expression unreadable. I didn't slow down. I walked straight to my front door, ignoring the way my mother opened her window, calling my name as if that alone would be enough to make me stop. Wait, my father's voice rang out. I sighed, my fingers tightening around my keys before turning to face them. You don't get to keep showing up here, I said coolly. This is my home, and I don't want you here. My mother flinched. Sweetheart, please just hear us out. No, I cut her off. You need to hear me. I told you already, I'm done. You don't get to ignore my kids for years and then decide you want to be grandparents when it's convenient for you. My father's jaw twitched, his usual arrogance cracking under the weight of his own guilt. That's not fair, my mother whispered. We made mistakes, yes, but we're trying. I let out a sharp laugh. Trying? You call this trying? I gestured to their presence, to the sheer audacity of them showing up at my doorstep as if that would erase the past. You're only here because you have nothing left, because you wasted everything on him. I turned my gaze to my brother, who was still leaning against his car, his face twisted into a sneer. You think you're so much better than us now? He spat. Just because you've got money? Just because you finally pulled yourself out of the gutter? I arched a brow. I was in the gutter, wasn't I? And where were you then? Where were they? He scoffed. You could have asked for help. I took a step closer. I did. His expression faltered. I asked for help, I continued, my voice steady, unwavering. I begged for it. And you know what they told me? Figure it out. Stop being jealous. Deal with it. I let the words hang between us, watching as my parents shifted uncomfortably, as the weight of their own cruelty finally seemed to sink in. So I did. And now that I have, you're all suddenly interested in being a family again? I shook my head. No, I said. You don't want to be in my life. You just don't want to be left behind. My mother broke down first. I wasn't surprised. She had always been the emotional one, the one who cried when things didn't go her way, who wielded her own suffering like a weapon, expecting everyone around her to fold beneath it. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she clutched her hands together, her fingers trembling. We just want to fix this, she whispered. We just want our family back. I studied her carefully. For a moment, I wondered if I should feel something, if I should allow her tears to chip away at the walls I had built around myself. But I felt nothing, because I had spent too many nights wondering why I wasn't enough. Too many days forcing myself to accept that I would never be their priority. And now, it was too late. You don't get to fix this, I murmured. You don't get to pretend it never happened. My father exhaled sharply. So what? That's it? You're just going to cut us out forever? I tilted my head. Haven't I always been cut out? His mouth pressed into a thin line. You made your choices, I continued, my voice cold. You chose him. You chose his kids. You made it very clear that we didn't matter. And now, you have to live with that. I turned toward my door again, gripping the handle. Wait. My brother's voice stopped me. But when I looked back at him, there was no anger in his eyes, no arrogance, just something else. Something I had never seen from him before. Fear. Pure, undeniable fear. And then, he spoke the words that shattered the final illusion I had been holding on to. They're broke. The words slipped out like a confession, like a truth he had been desperate to hide but could no longer contain. My stomach turned. I had known things weren't good for them. I had suspected that the reason they were suddenly reaching out had more to do with necessity than love. But hearing it said aloud, hearing my brother admit that the parents who had always held themselves above me, who had looked down on me for struggling, who had abandoned me in my worst moments, had lost everything, it was almost laughable. I let out a slow breath, meeting my brother's gaze. And let me guess, I murmured. You thought I'd fix it. He clenched his jaw. They thought family meant something to you. I chuckled, shaking my head. Family, I repeated. They weren't my family when I was sleeping in my car. They weren't my family when I was working 2 jobs just to survive. They weren't my family when I needed them. I took a step forward, my voice dropping to a whisper. And now? They're not my family now. He swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. They put all their money into you, I continued. All their love, all their trust, all their hope. And now that you've failed them, they think they can buy their way back into my life? My brother flinched. I had never seen him like this. So small, so fragile, so lost. For years he had lived in a world where he could do no wrong, where his failures were swept under the rug and his victories were celebrated. But now, the safety net was gone, and he was realizing what it felt like to be alone. I should have felt satisfied. I should have relished the moment, but I didn't, because, unlike him, I had never needed them to fail. I had only ever needed them to care. I exhaled slowly. Then, without another word, I walked inside and closed the door behind me. This time they didn't knock. And when I looked out the window, I saw my parents sitting in the car, their heads bowed, Their shoulders slumped in defeat. They finally understood what it felt like to be forgotten. The silence lasted 3 days. For 72 hours there were no texts, no calls, no unwanted visits. And since this entire mess started, I allowed myself to breathe. I wasn't naive enough to think it was over. I knew them well enough to understand that my rejection wouldn't be the end of it. My parents had spent their entire lives controlling the narrative, bending reality to suit their needs. They weren't the kind of people who just let go. But those 3 days of peace, they were a gift. A brief, fleeting moment where I didn't have to look over my shoulder, didn't have to prepare myself for the next wave of guilt, manipulation, or thinly veiled demands. I spent the time with my kids, soaking in the laughter, the warmth, the life we had built without them. And when the silence finally broke, I was ready. It happened late at night. I had just put the kids to bed, the house quiet except for the faint hum of the television playing in the background. I was halfway through cleaning up the kitchen when my phone buzzed. One glance at the screen told me everything I needed to know. It was my father. I ignored it. A minute later, another buzz, then another. I sighed, drying my hands before finally picking up the phone. I didn't answer, but I checked the messages, and the moment I read them, my stomach tightened. Dad, your brother screwed up. Badly. Dad, he needs help. Dad, if you won't do it for us, do it for your nephews. I exhaled slowly, staring at the screen, feeling the familiar weight of expectation settle over me. It was always the same pattern. He messes up, they scramble to fix it. And when they realize they can't, they come to me. It had been that way since we were kids. He would break things, and I would be the one forced to pick up the pieces. Only now, the stakes were higher. I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply before typing out a response. Me. Not my problem. I hit send and tossed the phone onto the counter. A part of me wondered how bad it was. The selfish part of me wanted to know. Wanted to see the extent of the damage, to watch the consequences of a lifetime of indulgence finally catch up to them. But the rational part, the part of me that had suffered because of them, it reminded me that I didn't owe them anything. Not anymore. The next morning the calls started again. I ignored the first 5. But by the 6th, I was annoyed enough to answer. What? There was silence on the other end. Then a sigh. Please, my mother whispered. I froze. Not because of the word itself, but because of the way she said it. She wasn't pleading, she was begging. My mother had spent my entire life pretending she was untouchable, that she was above emotion, that nothing could shake her composure. And now she sounded afraid. I gritted my teeth. What happened? A pause. Then, he's being investigated. I went still. My mind ran through the possibilities, each one worse than the last. My brother had always been reckless, but he had never faced real consequences before. He had been shielded from them his entire life, his mistakes swept under the rug before they could become real problems. But this wasn't something my parents could fix. I exhaled sharply. What did he do? Another pause. Then my mother's voice, small, broken. Fraud. I should have seen it coming. The expensive cars, the lavish vacations, the constant spending. My brother had never worked for anything. He had always relied on them to support his lifestyle. But once the money ran dry, he must have found other ways to maintain his illusion of success. And now, it had finally caught up to him. I leaned against the counter, rubbing my temple. How bad is it? The company he worked for found irregularities in the accounts. My mother admitted, her voice shaking. They started digging, and now the authorities are involved. If he gets charged, he's going to prison, I finished flatly, a strangled sob. Please, she whispered. Please, we don't know what to do. We don't have the money for lawyers. We don't have anything. I closed my eyes. There it is. The real reason they wanted back into my life. Not because they regretted what they did to me, not because they wanted to make amends, but because they needed a way out. And I was their last resort. How much? I asked, my voice void of emotion. She hesitated. What? How much do you want? I said, sharper this time. Let's skip the pretending. You don't want me. You want money. So how much? She let out a choked noise. It's not like that. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "It's exactly like that," I said. "You don't care about me. You never have. If I was still struggling, you wouldn't be calling. If I was still living paycheck to paycheck, you wouldn't be begging. The only reason you're here is because I made it out." Silence. And then, so softly I almost didn't hear it, "We just want our family back." I exhaled, gripping the phone tighter. "No," I whispered. "You just don't want to be alone." I didn't wait for a response. I ended the call, and this time I blocked their numbers. It should have felt like a victory. But as I sat there staring at my reflection in the window, I felt nothing but exhaustion. They had drained me. For years I had fought to prove that I mattered, that I was worthy of love, of attention, of anything. And when they had ignored me, I had told myself that one day, they would realize their mistake, that they would see me. And now, they had realized it. Not because they missed me, not because they loved me, but because they had nowhere else to turn. I had won. But at what cost? I swallowed the lump in my throat and stood up, shaking off the weight of the past. This was my life now, and I wasn't going to waste it on people who had never deserved me. The silence after I blocked them was different this time. Not the tense, expectant quiet of a battle waiting to resume, but something heavier, something final. I had severed the last thread that bound me to them. There would be no more calls, no more desperate pleas, no more guilt-laden manipulation. I had shut the door, locked it, and thrown away the key. And yet, some part of me, some stubborn, deeply ingrained part, still expected them to find another way back in. But days passed, then weeks, and the silence remained. They had finally given up. I didn't tell my kids what happened, not in detail at least. They had never been close to my parents to begin with. How could they be, when they had always been treated like an afterthought? But I knew they had noticed the shift, the absence of a conversation that had lingered in our home for far too long. One evening, as I tucked my youngest into bed, she looked up at me with wide, curious eyes. "Are they gone?" she asked softly. I hesitated. Then, with a quiet nod, I said, "Yes." She thought about this for a moment before reaching for my hand, squeezing it with her tiny fingers. "Good," she whispered. I swallowed past the lump in my throat. She wasn't sad. She wasn't confused. She wasn't grieving the loss of something that had never really been there. Because unlike me, she had never spent her life hoping for something more. A month later, I heard about my brother's sentencing. I hadn't gone to the trial. I hadn't asked for updates, but some people in town still remembered our family, and word had a way of traveling. 5 years. That was the verdict. 5 years for fraud, embezzlement, and a string of financial crimes that had finally caught up to him. My parents had been in the courtroom when the judge read the sentence. I could picture it perfectly, the way my mother had likely gasped, clutching her chest like the victim she always believed herself to be. My father, silent and rigid, barely holding himself together. And my brother? I wondered if he had felt anything at all, if he had even grasped the weight of what was happening to him. But I didn't go to see him. I didn't reach out. I had spent a lifetime cleaning up his messes. I wasn't about to start now. They tried to reach me one last time, not with a phone call or a surprise visit, but with a letter. I found it in my mailbox one morning, tucked between a stack of bills and junk mail. There was no return address. Just my name, scrawled in handwriting I had once known better than my own. I should have thrown it away. I should have tossed it in the garbage without a second thought. But some foolish, lingering part of me needed to know. So I opened it. Inside, there was only a single sheet of paper. "We don't know how to fix this, but we're sorry." I stared at the words for a long time. They weren't long-winded. They weren't manipulative. For once in their lives, they weren't making excuses. They were just apologizing. I let out a slow breath, and then I burned the letter, because I had already given them all the chances they deserved, and I wasn't going to waste another second of my life waiting for them to become the people they should have been all along. I never heard from them again. My parents faded from my life like ghosts, whispers of the past that no longer had a place in my present. And my brother? He had 5 years to think about everything he had lost, but I wasn't waiting for him when he got out. I was too busy living the life I had built for myself. A life without them. A life finally free.